Julian Vance considered the weight of the papers in his hand. They were not heavy, just a few dozen sheets of high-grade linen bond, but they felt as dense as a tombstone. This, he thought with a surge of triumphant finality, was the end of a long, slow, dreary chapter and the beginning of everything else. He stood in the center of the living room, a space defined by cool, minimalist lines and an abundance of natural light pouring in from the floor-to-ceiling windows. It was a beautiful house, an architectural marvel of glass and steel softened by curated pieces of art. It was his wife's masterpiece, the one project she had ever truly completed. And soon, it would be his. Across from him, Alara sat in a low-slung armchair, her posture as straight and unassuming as ever. A book lay open in her lap, though she hadn't turned a page in the last 10 minutes. She was watching him, her expression unreadable, her gaze calm. That was Alara's way, quiet, observant, and in Julian's opinion, utterly devoid of the fire that made life worth living. She was a woman drawn in shades of gray, a constant, low hum of disappointment in a world where he craved a symphony. Behind him, a light musical laugh tinkled. Chloe Sterling, vibrant and shimmering, leaned against the doorframe, a glass of champagne in her hand. Her presence was a splash of brilliant color in the muted palette of his marriage. She was everything Alara was not, effervescent, ambitious in a way he understood, and openly admiring of his own perceived brilliance. "Are you going to stand there all day, Julian?" Chloe prompted, her voice a silken purr. "Or are you going to get on with it?" Julian took a fortifying breath, the scent of Chloe's expensive perfume filling his senses and stealing his resolve. He strode across the polished concrete floor, the crisp sound of his leather shoes, the only noise in the cavernous room. He stopped before Alara's chair, looking down at her. For 10 years, he had looked at this woman and seen a series of gentle failures. An architect who designed beautiful homes on paper, but could never seem to land the big clients. A wife who was content with quiet evenings and intellectual pursuits, rather than the glittering social scene he yearned to dominate. A partner who, he believed, was holding him back. "Ilara," he began, his voice taking on a tone of practiced, solemn gravity. "We need to talk." She looked up from her book, her eyes, a deep, thoughtful brown, meeting his. "It seems you've already decided on the topic of conversation, Julian." He ignored the subtle challenge. He placed the thick envelope on the book in her lap. The words, "Vance versus Vance, petition for dissolution of marriage," were visible through the envelope's window. "I think this is for the best," he said, the words feeling smooth and rehearsed. "We've grown apart. We want different things. I want a life of more, and you are content with this." He gestured vaguely around the room, at the quiet dignity of the space, as if it were a prison. Chloe chose that moment to walk forward, her heels clicking a triumphant rhythm on the floor. She stood beside Julian, draping a possessive arm through his. She looked at Alara, her smile a mixture of pity and contempt. "What he means, Alara, is that he's chosen me. We're in love." Ilara's gaze flickered from the papers to Chloe's perfectly manicured hand on her husband's arm, then back to Julian's face. There was no shock, no outburst of tears, no desperate plea. There was only a profound stillness, a gathering of quiet energy that the two of them, in their glittering self-absorption, completely failed to notice. Julian had expected drama, a scene that would validate his decision, that would prove Alara's emotional instability. Instead, he was met with a silence that was more unsettling than any scream. He thought he knew everything about the woman sitting before him. He knew her favorite author, the way she took her coffee, the quiet frustration she felt after another failed project bid. He knew her assets, a modest portfolio and the equity in this house, which he had already calculated his share of. He had built his entire plan around the certainty of her weakness, her predictability, her fundamental smallness. What Julian Vance did not know was that the woman he was so casually discarding was not just Ilara Vance, the moderately successful architect. In a world of finance and technology that he couldn't even begin to comprehend, she was known by a single mythical name: Helios. She was the anonymous, ghost-like founder of Aethelred Industries, a global titan of sustainable technology and architectural innovation valued at over $40 billion. The quiet nights she spent in her study weren't for drafting unrealized blueprints. They were for commanding a global empire, for making decisions that shifted markets and reshaped skylines across the world. The house he was so eager to claim? She had not just designed it, she had built it with materials and technologies developed by her own company, a mere plaything. The life he considered small was a deliberate shield, a sanctuary of simplicity she had built to protect herself from the noise of the world he so desperately coveted. He saw a timid sparrow. He had no idea he was attempting to cage a phoenix. And as he stood there, puffed up with the pride of his affair and the promise of a new life, he had just set the match to his own. Within 6 weeks, his world would be nothing but ash. It's a powerful story, isn't it? The idea of hidden strength, of the world finally seeing you for who you truly are. We're about to watch Alara's journey unfold, and I promise you, it's a path of incredible vindication. Before we dive deeper, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Drop your city or country in the comments below. It's always amazing to see our global community come together. And if you're as excited as I am to see Julian and Chloe get what's coming to them, do me a favor and hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens next. Now let's get back to the moment the fuse was lit. The silence in the room stretched, becoming a tangible presence. Julian shifted his weight, the smug confidence beginning to curdle into irritation. He wanted a reaction, a clear sign that he had inflicted a wound. Ilara's composure was a denial of his power. "Well," he pressed, "aren't you going to say anything?" Ilara slowly closed the book, the weight of the legal documents a strange intrusion on the familiar comfort of the worn cover. She placed it carefully on the side table. Then she lifted her gaze, and for the first time, Julian saw a flicker of something other than placid acceptance. It wasn't anger, it was assessment. She was looking at him as if he were a complex problem, a structural flaw she was analyzing from all angles. "There is a great deal to say, Julian," she said, her voice even and low. "But I suspect you are not interested in hearing any of it right now. You are interested only in your own narrative." She rose from the chair with a fluid grace that seemed to contradict the narrative of a defeated woman. She was not tall, but she held herself with an innate dignity that made her seem to fill more space than her frame suggested. "Chloe," she said, turning her head slightly to acknowledge the other woman, "I assume you'll be staying." Chloe's triumphant smile widened. "I've already moved a few things in," Julian insisted. "I see," Alara replied. Her eyes swept over Chloe, a quick, dispassionate inventory. "The guest room at the end of the hall is prepared. You'll find fresh linens in the closet." The statement was so practical, so devoid of jealousy, that it momentarily threw Chloe off balance. She had come prepared for a fight, for a screaming match, for the satisfying drama of a woman scorned. This cool, detached hospitality was not in the script. "Oh, I won't be staying in the guest room," Chloe said, recovering quickly, her voice dripping with condescension. "I'll be staying here, with Julian." She tightened her grip on his arm, a gesture of staking her claim on both the man and the master bedroom. A long moment passed. Ilara's gaze settled on her husband. "Is that your wish, Julian, for me to vacate our bedroom tonight?" This was it, the first test of his new, liberated life. He had to be firm. "It's for the best, Ilara, to make a clean break." He expected her to argue, to appeal to their shared history, to the sanctity of their marital bed. Instead, she simply nodded. "Very well. I will move my things into the West Guest Suite. It has a better view of the city at dawn." She walked toward the grand, floating staircase without a single backward glance, her movements unhurried. At the base of the stairs, she paused and turned back. "Julian, the property taxes are due at the end of the month. The notice is on the desk in the study. Since you are so eager to take possession of the house, I trust you'll be handling that." It was a simple, domestic instruction, yet it landed with the force of a quiet threat. It was a reminder of the practical burdens he was so gleefully taking on. He just grunted in response, and she ascended the stairs, disappearing from view. "Well," Chloe huffed, a little deflated, "that was anticlimactic." "That's Alara for you," Julian said, forcing a laugh. "Always goes out with a whimper, not a bang." But even as he said it, a sliver of unease worked its way into his mind. Her calm was unnatural. It felt less like surrender and more like the deep, still water that hides a powerful current. He pushed the feeling aside. It was just wishful thinking, his mind playing tricks. He had won. He had everything he wanted. He pulled Chloe to him, kissing her deeply, trying to erase the unsettling image of his wife's analytical gaze. Upstairs, in the sprawling West guest suite, a room larger than most city apartments, Alara did not weep. She did not throw things. She walked to the window that overlooked the glittering expanse of the city and placed her hand on the cool glass. She took a deep, steadying breath. For years she had lived a double life, carefully compartmentalizing the fierce, decisive mind of Helios from the quiet, unassuming persona of Alara Vance. She had done it for peace, for anonymity, for the freedom to create without the burden of fame. She had believed, naively perhaps, that she could have a quiet, loving partnership separate from that world. Julian's betrayal was not just the end of a marriage, it was the collapse of that carefully constructed partition. He and Chloe had not just invaded her home, they had breached the sanctuary. She turned from the window and walked to her travel bag, which she had packed 2 days ago. From a side pocket, she retrieved a simple, unadorned leather folio. It looked like an artist's portfolio, something to carry sketches or blueprints. She ran her fingers over the worn leather. This was her symbolic object, the physical manifestation of her hidden power. Inside were not drawings, but the foundational documents of her empire, the proof of her true identity. She had known this day was coming. Julian's discontent had been a low-grade fever for years. His indiscretion with Chloe was merely the symptom that had finally broken. She had been preparing. She opened the folio and took out a single sheet of paper. It was a list. On it, in her neat, precise handwriting, were dozens of entries, each with a date and a short description. June 12th. Jay mocked my hobby designs at the Henderson dinner, called them unrealistic fantasies. Chloe laughed. August 29th. Jay forgot our anniversary, took C to the coast instead, said it was a networking trip. October 5th. Jay's mother called my work a cute little pastime and suggested I focus on being a more supportive wife. It was her list of grievances. Each slight, each insult, each moment of casual cruelty. She had not recorded them out of pettiness, but for clarity. It was a ledger of disrespect, a catalog of the 1,000 cuts that had severed their bond long before Chloe's arrival. This was not about a broken heart, it was about a fundamental breach of respect. And in Alara's world, in the world of Helios, respect was the only currency that truly mattered. She picked up her secure satellite phone, a sleek, unmarked device, and dialed a number. "Marcus," she said, her voice now stripped of all wifely softness, replaced by the crisp, authoritative tone of a CEO. "It's started. Execute protocol, Phoenix." There was a pause. Yes, he did. With her here. Proceed as planned. And Marcus, leave him the house for now. Let him feel like a king in his castle. The fall will be that much greater. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in humiliation, a slow, deliberate tightening of a psychological vice. Julian, believing he had secured a swift and easy victory, moved Chloe into the master suite with a brazen lack of decorum. They treated Alara not as the co-owner of the home, but as a tenant on sufferance, a ghost haunting the hallways of her own life. Chloe, in particular, seemed to derive a special pleasure from tormenting her. She would accidentally spill red wine on the pristine white sofa, a custom piece Alara had designed herself. "Oh, clumsy me!" Chloe would exclaim with a theatrical gasp, looking at Alara with wide, insincere eyes. "But I suppose you can just get a new one." "Oh, wait." The unspoken addendum hung in the air. "You won't be able to afford it soon." Julian, for his part, enabled it all. He would watch these small cruelties with a smirk, seeing them as confirmation of Chloe's fiery spirit compared to Alara's passive nature. He began hosting small, impromptu gatherings with his friends, a circle of equally status-obsessed mid-level managers and their partners. In these moments, Alara became the centerpiece of their amusement. One evening, they gathered in the living room. Julian was holding court, a glass of expensive whiskey in his hand. Chloe was perched on the arm of his chair, looking like a queen on her throne. Alara had been in her study, the room Julian now called the hobby room, when he had insisted she join them. "Come on, Alara, don't be a hermit. Mingle a little. See what a real social life looks like." She had emerged, composed as ever, and taken a seat slightly apart from the main group. One of Julian's friends, a smarmy sales director named Todd, gestured toward the intricate architectural model of a sustainable community center that sat on a console table. It was a project Alara had poured her heart into, a design that had been a finalist for a prestigious grant, but had ultimately been rejected. "Still got that thing, Alara?" Todd asked, his tone laced with mock sympathy. "I remember Julian telling us about it. Such a shame it didn't work out. Too idealistic, I guess." "The world isn't ready for utopia," Chloe chimed in, waving a dismissive hand. "People want what's real, what's tangible, big, shiny, and expensive." She looked pointedly at the diamond bracelet on her wrist, a recent gift from Julian. Julian chuckled, a low, rumbling sound of agreement. "Alara has always lived a bit in the clouds. Beautiful ideas, no practical application. It's a fundamental difference between us. I'm a realist. I build things in the real world." He puffed out his chest, referring to his role overseeing a department that implemented cost-cutting measures at a regional bank. Alara sat through it all, her hands resting in her lap. Her gaze drifted from their smug faces to the model. They saw a failure, a monument to her professional inadequacy. They had no idea that the core technology in that idealistic model, a revolutionary solar capturing glass and a gray water recycling system, was already being manufactured on a massive scale by Ethelred Industries. It was being installed in a new corporate headquarters in Tokyo and a government complex in Berlin. The grant she had lost had been a test balloon, a way to gauge public and academic response without revealing her hand. The project's failure had yielded billions in data and market intelligence. Her mind was a whirlwind of calculations and strategic considerations, but her expression remained one of serene detachment. Inside her pocket, her fingers found the smooth, cool edge of a small metallic object, a simple, unassuming keycard. It bore no markings, no logo, nothing to distinguish it from 1,000 other generic access cards. But it was the master key to the Ethelred Tower, the gleaming nerve center of her global operations. Sometimes, when the weight of their condescension felt particularly heavy, she would touch it. It was a silent reminder of the vast, complex reality that existed just beyond their pathetically small field of vision. "You know," Chloe continued, emboldened by Alara's silence, "I've been thinking of redecorating. This whole minimalist thing is so cold. It needs warmth, color, life." She looked around the room, her eyes critically dismissing every carefully chosen element. "I'm thinking jewel tones, velvet, maybe a nice big portrait of Julian and me right over the fireplace. That's a load-bearing structural wall composed of reinforced, thermally responsive concrete," Alara stated, her voice calm and factual. You can't hang anything heavier than a small canvas on it without compromising its integrity. Chloe rolled her eyes. Oh, listen to the architect. Don't worry, honey. We'll hire a real professional to handle it. The group tittered with laughter. Julian put his arm around Chloe and squeezed her shoulder. That's my girl, always thinking bigger. Later that night, Ilara stood in the West Guest Suite, looking not at the city, but at her reflection in the darkened glass. She saw the face of the woman they all believed her to be, plain, quiet, defeated. But her eyes held a different story. They held the cool fire of a strategist moving her pieces into place on a global chessboard. She had let them mock her model. She had let them dismiss her expertise about her own home. Every insult, every slight, was a nail they were hammering into their own coffins. She picked up her secure phone again. Marcus, Phase 2, begin the asset isolation. I want every account, every holding, every share traced back to its Aethelred origin point. Create a firewalled portfolio under my personal designation. Leave the joint marital accounts as they are for now. Let him think the pond is full, right before I drain it. She paused, listening. And the house? The deed is already held by an Aethelred subsidiary, isn't it? A faint smile touched her lips. Excellent. Let him pay the property taxes. It will be the most expensive rent he has ever paid. She disconnected the call and turned back to the window, the city lights glittering like a galaxy of promises. They thought they were taking her world. In reality, they were living on a small, rented island in the middle of her ocean, and the tide was about to come in. The arrival of Eleanor Vance was, for Julian, the final, validating seal of approval on his new life. His mother, a woman for whom appearances were paramount and status was a religion, had always viewed Ilara with a thinly veiled disappointment. Eleanor was old money, or at least she carried herself as if she were. Her wealth derived from a series of shrewd, if uninspired, real estate investments made by her late husband. She saw in Ilara a lack of social ambition, a baffling contentment with intellectual pursuits over advantageous connections. Eleanor swept into the house a week after the divorce papers were served, her presence as subtle as a gale-force wind. She was dressed in a tailored Chanel suit, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, her expression one of regal inspection. She ignored Ilara completely, walking past her as if she were a piece of furniture, and went straight to Julian, kissing both his cheeks. "Julian, darling," she breathed, her voice a low, aristocratic murmur. "I came as soon as I heard. You must be so relieved." Then she turned to Chloe, who had positioned herself perfectly to be received. Eleanor's critical eyes swept over her, from her stylish dress to her confident smile. A slow, approving nod was her verdict. "And you must be Chloe. Julian has told me so much about you. It is a pleasure to finally meet the woman who has brought the light back into my son's eyes." Chloe preened under the matriarch's approval. "The pleasure is all mine, Mrs. Vance. I've heard so much about you." "Please, call me Eleanor," she said, a privilege she had never extended to Ilara in a decade. Ilara had been arranging flowers in a vase on the console table. She continued her work, trimming a stem with practiced precision, her back to them. The entire scene played out behind her, a drama of calculated slights and social maneuvering. "Well, the place still looks the same," Eleanor commented, her gaze sweeping the living room with disdain. "So sterile. It needs a woman's touch, a real woman's touch." She shot a meaningful look at Chloe, who giggled in agreement. They settled on the sofa, a conspiratorial trio. Ilara could hear their murmurs, punctuated by Eleanor's sharp, critical tone and Chloe's eager laughter. They were dissecting her, piece by piece, right in her own home. "I never understood what you saw in her, Julian," Eleanor said, not bothering to lower her voice. "She has no drive. That little architecture hobby of hers, it was cute for a while, but a man of your stature needs a partner who can keep up, who can build a social foundation for your career." "That's what I've been saying for years, Mother," Julian replied, his voice filled with self-righteous justification. "I need a power couple. With Chloe, I feel like we can take on the world." "Exactly. And she's so lifeless," Eleanor continued, warming to her theme. "I remember that dreadful firm dinner last year. She sat there talking about sustainable building materials with old Mr. Abernathy while the CEO's wife was trying to organize the charity gala. No concept of priorities." Elara placed the final flower in the vase, a single white rose, and turned. She walked over to the small bar cart and poured herself a glass of water, her movements calm and deliberate. She could feel their eyes on her, waiting for her to break, to give them the satisfaction of her pain. She turned and faced them, taking a slow sip of water. "Eleanor," she said, her voice even, "it's good to see you. I trust your trip was pleasant." Eleanor was taken aback by the direct address. She gave Elara a frosty look. "It was fine. I'm here to support my son through this difficult transition." "Of course," Elara said. "Family is so important at a time like this." Her eyes met Julian's. "I was just in the study, reviewing some of our shared finances for the settlement. It's more complex than I initially thought. So many overlapping accounts and investments." Julian stiffened. This was the first time she had brought up the mechanics of the divorce. "My lawyer will handle all of that. It's quite straightforward, actually." "Is it?" Elara asked, a hint of genuine curiosity in her voice. "Because I was looking at the portfolio your father left you, Eleanor. The one you advised Julian to invest in 3 years ago. The commercial real estate holdings in the downtown sector." Eleanor sat up straighter, a flicker of unease in her eyes. "It's a very solid, blue-chip portfolio. It's performed admirably." "It has," Elara agreed. "But I noticed a significant number of the tenants in those buildings, the high-value tech and finance leases, are scheduled for relocation over the next 18 months. They're moving to the new Titan North development on the waterfront." A heavy silence fell over the trio. Julian looked from Elara to his mother, confused. "That's just a rumor," Eleanor said sharply. "That development is years away from completion." "Actually," Elara said, taking another sip of water, "the primary contractor, a firm called Ethelred Construction, has an impeccable record of finishing ahead of schedule. Their new efficiency protocols are unprecedented. The first phase is set to open in 10 months. I read an article about it." She paused. "Once those anchor tenants leave, the property values in the downtown sector are projected to decrease by as much as 40%. Your solid portfolio is about to become a significant liability." She delivered this devastating financial analysis with the same calm tone she would use to comment on the weather. She wasn't being malicious. She was simply stating facts. But to Eleanor, whose entire identity was built on her financial acumen, it was a direct and brutal assault. The color drained from the older woman's face. Julian, seeing his mother's distress, jumped to her defense. "What would you know about it, Elara? You're an architect, not a financial analyst. You're just trying to scare us." Elara looked at him, and for a fleeting moment, a genuine sadness crossed her features. The chasm between who he thought she was and who she truly was had never seemed so vast. "You're right, Julian. It's probably nothing to worry about." She turned and walked back toward the staircase, leaving them in a state of disarray. The triumphant, conspiratorial atmosphere had evaporated, replaced by a thick cloud of anxiety. Chloe looked at Julian, her expression uncertain. Julian was staring at his mother, who was now muttering about calling her broker. Up in her room, Elara sat at the desk overlooking the city. Her statement about the Titan North development was, of course, entirely accurate. She knew because she had personally signed the order to accelerate the construction schedule 2 weeks ago. Ethelred Construction was her subsidiary. The high-value tech and finance leases were all companies she either owned or had significant stakes in. She was, in effect, the one pulling the tenants from her mother-in-law's buildings. It wasn't a personal attack. It was simply good business, consolidating her assets into her own superior properties. But the fact that Eleanor's portfolio would be collateral damage was a consequence Elara was willing to accept. It was a form of poetic justice. Eleanor had judged her for her lack of ambition, all while her own safe wealth was unknowingly crumbling at the hands of the very woman she disdained. Elara opened her leather folio, the ledger of her secret world. She made a new note. November 2nd, EV visited, disparaged my career, questioned my worth, informed her of the impending collapse of her real estate portfolio. She closed the book. This was not just a divorce, it was a rebalancing of the scales. And the scales were tipping, slowly but irrevocably, in her favor. The dinner party was Julian's idea of a coronation. It was to be a gathering of his inner circle, a formal debut for Chloe as the lady of the house, and a final public humiliation of Elara. He insisted she be there. "It's important we show everyone we can be civil," he'd said, the lie tasting sweet on his tongue. What he really wanted was a captive audience to witness his triumph. So, on a crisp Saturday evening, the house filled with the sounds of laughter and clinking glasses. Julian's friends, the same sycophantic crowd from before, mingled in the living room, their compliments to Chloe as loud and ostentatious as her jewelry. Chloe herself was radiant, dressed in a crimson gown that stood in stark contrast to the room's cool tones. She moved through the space as if she had been born to it, accepting praise for the food, catered, the wine, from Julian's cellar, and the ambiance of a home she had no part in creating. Elara, dressed in a simple but elegant black dress, was a quiet island in the sea of forced merriment. She spoke when spoken to, her replies polite and brief. She observed the proceedings with the detached air of an anthropologist studying a foreign tribe. She saw the hungry ambition in their eyes, the way they assessed each other's clothing and accessories, the constant, subtle jockeying for position. It was a world built on the shakiest of foundations, perception. Dinner was served at the long, polished oak table in the dining room. Elara found herself seated at the far end, an intentional placement that physically marginalized her from the center of power, where Julian and Chloe presided. The conversation was loud and self-congratulatory. They spoke of promotions, bonuses, and expensive vacations. At one point, Julian raised his glass. "A toast," he announced, his voice booming with confidence. "To new beginnings, to a future filled with passion, ambition, and success." All eyes turned to him and Chloe. Glasses were raised. "To the future," they all echoed. As the toast concluded, Todd, the perpetually smarmy sales director, turned his attention to Elara. "Must be tough, Elara," he said, his voice oozing false concern. "Being at a crossroads like this. Any thoughts on what you'll do next? Maybe design a nice little cottage for yourself somewhere?" The table fell quiet, sensing the blood in the water. "I have a few projects I'm considering," Elara replied calmly, taking a sip of water. Chloe let out a little laugh. "Oh, let me guess. Another eco-friendly, mud hut village that runs on positive thinking?" The table erupted in sycophantic laughter. "Actually," Elara said, setting her glass down, her voice cutting through the noise with quiet authority, "I was thinking of something on a slightly larger scale." Julian leaned forward, a condescending smile on his face. "Do tell, Elara. We're all ears. Finally landed a client for one of your dream houses?" Elara met his gaze across the long expanse of the table. "I've been exploring a potential acquisition, a company that has been underperforming lately but has good bones. Strong infrastructure, but poor leadership. It's in the financial sector." Julian's smile faltered slightly. This was not the talk of a defeated woman planning to build a cottage. "An acquisition? Elara, that takes capital, a lot of capital." "Yes, it does," she agreed. "But I believe the long-term value is there. The company is called Consolidated Mutual Bank." A fork clattered onto a plate. It was Julian's. His face had gone pale. Consolidated Mutual Bank was the regional institution where he worked, where he had just been celebrating his latest promotion. That's not funny, Alara, he stammered. I'm not being funny, she said, her expression perfectly serious. Their stock has been undervalued for 2 quarters. Their cost-cutting measures have alienated their customer base, and their board is in disarray. It's a prime target for a hostile takeover and restructuring, starting from the top, of course. The current executive team seems to lack a clear vision for the future. Every word was a perfectly aimed dart, striking him with pinpoint accuracy. She was using his own corporate jargon against him, describing his company, his career, his entire professional identity as a failing enterprise she was casually considering buying and dismantling. The silence at the table was now thick and suffocating. Julian's friends stared, their expressions a mixture of shock and confusion. They couldn't comprehend what was happening. Was this a joke? Was she delusional? Chloe looked from Julian's ashen face to Alara's calm one, a flicker of genuine fear in her eyes for the first time. The power dynamic at the table had just shifted, subtly but seismically. You're insane, Julian finally managed to say, his voice a choked whisper. You don't have 2 pennies to rub together. How could you possibly? One should never underestimate the importance of having silent partners, Alara said, her voice a soft murmur. She picked up her fork and took a delicate bite of her salad, as if she had just been discussing the weather. She didn't need to say another word. The bomb had been planted. The image of her as a powerless, pitiable figure had been shattered. In its place was something new and terrifying, an unknown. The rest of the dinner was a stilted, awkward affair. The boisterous confidence had vanished, replaced by whispered conversations and nervous glances toward the end of the table. The party broke up early, the guests offering hasty, uncomfortable goodbyes. Once they were alone, Julian rounded on Alara, his face a mask of fury. What was that? What the hell was that? You were trying to embarrass me. Was I? Alara asked, rising from her chair. I was simply making conversation. You and your friends are so interested in business and acquisitions. I thought you'd find it stimulating. Don't play games with me, Alara. Consolidated Mutual? Where did you even hear that? You can't just buy a bank. Why not? She asked, her gaze steady. Is there a rule against it? He stared at her, speechless. He was looking at his wife of 10 years, but it felt as if he were seeing a stranger. The predictable gray woman he thought he knew had vanished. This woman was calm, calculating, and utterly unfathomable. You are going to sign those papers, he hissed, his voice low and menacing. You are going to take the settlement my lawyer offers, and you are going to get out of my life. Do you understand me? Alara walked past him towards the stairs. As she did, she paused. Your threats are as empty as your compliments, Julian. You should be less concerned with my plans and more concerned with your own. She glanced at the financial news app open on his phone, which was showing CMB's plummeting stock price. It looks like you'll have bigger problems than me very soon. She ascended the stairs, leaving him standing alone in the wreckage of his triumphant evening. He was shaking, not just with rage, but with a new and unfamiliar emotion, fear. For the first time, he had the distinct and terrifying feeling that he was not the one in control. He had started a game without knowing the rules, and his opponent, the woman he had dismissed as a novice, was playing at a level he couldn't even begin to comprehend. In the final week before the scheduled mediation, a strange and deceptive calm settled over the house. Julian and Chloe, unnerved by Alara's performance at the dinner party, treated her with a new, wary distance. The open mockery ceased, replaced by suspicious glances and whispered conversations behind closed doors. They interpreted her quiet confidence as a bluff, a desperate, last-ditch psychological gambit. They clung to this belief because the alternative was too terrifying to contemplate. They spent their days planning the future they felt was rightfully theirs. They browsed luxury car websites, and looked at listings for vacation homes in Aspen, spending the money from the settlement before it was even in their hands. Julian's lawyer, a slick, overconfident man named Richard Croft, had assured him it was an open and shut case. "She has no independent wealth to speak of," Croft had said. "The house is the main asset. We'll offer her 40% of the equity. She'll be lucky to get that. With her income, no judge will give her more." Julian repeated these words to himself like a mantra, a shield against the creeping doubt Elara had planted in his mind. While they dreamed of a future funded by her capitulation, Elara moved with the quiet, methodical purpose of a grandmaster preparing for checkmate. Her days were a study in contrasts. To Julian and Chloe, she was a silent presence, reading in the garden or sketching in a notebook in her suite. They saw inactivity, a woman waiting for her fate to be decided. In reality, her suite had become a silent command center. The sketches were not idle drawings, but flowcharts mapping out corporate restructuring. The books were not novels, but deep-dive financial reports on global markets. And the long, quiet hours were filled with a flurry of encrypted calls and secure video conferences that spanned the globe. "Marcus," she said one afternoon, her eyes fixed on a holographic projection of a sprawling new campus displayed on her desk. "The Board of Consolidated Mutual has received our preliminary offer. They're panicking." On the screen, Marcus Thorne, the public face and CEO of Aethelred Industries, nodded. He was a handsome, silver-haired man with a reassuringly calm demeanor that masked a razor-sharp intellect. He was her most trusted ally, the man she had chosen years ago to be the vessel for her vision while she remained in the shadows. "They're calling it a predatory, unsolicited bid," Marcus reported, a ghost of a smile on his face. "They've issued a press release vowing to fight it. Their stock dropped another 7% on the news." "Let them fight," Elara said. "It only makes them look weaker. Prepare the secondary offer, 20% higher, all cash. But don't release it yet. I want it to land precisely 1 hour after the mediation meeting concludes tomorrow. I want the news of my takeover to break at the exact moment Julian is processing his own new reality." "The timing is poetic," Marcus noted. "It is strategic," Elara corrected gently. "Every action must have a purpose. What about the other matter, the Vance portfolio?" "The trap is set," Marcus confirmed. "Eleanor's broker has been trying to offload her downtown properties all week, but the market is spooked. No one is buying. Our subsidiary, Argent Development, made a lowball offer this morning, 30 cents on the dollar. Her broker is advising her to take it before it gets worse. She'll be selling her legacy to me at a staggering loss, and she won't even know it's me," Elara murmured, a touch of melancholy in her voice. "There's a tragedy in that." "She made her bed, Elara," Marcus said softly. "You're just tucking her into it." "And the house?" Elara asked, her gaze drifting toward the window. "The eviction notices are drafted and ready to be served. The ownership transfer from the Aethelred subsidiary back to your personal name is complete. As of 9 a.m. tomorrow, you will be the sole, undisputed owner of the property and the land it sits on. The mortgage Julian believes he's been paying into? It was paid off by you, in cash, 6 years ago. His payments have been going into a trust account, which we have also firewalled." "Good," Elara said. Every detail was falling into place. Every contingency was planned for. She had built her empire on a foundation of meticulous planning and flawless execution, and she was applying the same principles to the dismantling of her old life. That evening, the night before the final confrontation, a heavy storm rolled in. Rain lashed against the great glass walls of the house. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Julian and Chloe had gone out for a celebratory Last Supper before their victory, leaving Elara alone in the vast, echoing space. She didn't turn on the lights. She sat in the living room, in the same armchair where Julian had served her the divorce papers weeks ago. The room was illuminated only by flashes of lightning, which momentarily lit up the space in stark, dramatic relief. She looked at the architectural model of her failed community center. She thought of all the insults, all the condescension, all the willful blindness. There was a part of her that mourned the man Julian could have been, the partnership they might have had if he had ever bothered to look past the surface. But that grief was a distant, faded thing now, replaced by a cold, clear sense of purpose. He had not just betrayed her, he had fundamentally disrespected the core of who she was. He had looked at a masterpiece of engineering and intellect and seen only a quiet, unassuming woman. He had mistaken her patience for weakness, her silence for submission. Tomorrow, she would correct his misconception. She reached into her pocket and her fingers closed around the cool metal of the unmarked keycard, the key to her real world. Tomorrow, she would finally use it to unlock the door between her two lives, not just for herself, but for them. She would show them the world they had been too blind to see. The storm outside raged, a perfect symphony for the tempest she was about to unleash. She was not nervous. She was not angry. She felt a profound and liberating calm. It was the quiet before the storm, the deep, still breath before the final, decisive move. The game was over. All that remained was to turn over the cards and declare the winner. And as the lightning flashed, illuminating her serene face, it was clear that the woman sitting in the darkness was not the person who was about to lose everything. She was the one who had held all the power all along. The law offices of Croft, Banner, and Finch were designed to intimidate. Located on the 50th floor of a downtown skyscraper, the reception area was a study in cold, corporate power. Gleaming marble floors, dark mahogany walls, and a panoramic view of the city that seemed to proclaim dominion over everything it surveyed. Julian Vance walked in with a swagger, Chloe clinging to his arm, her expression radiating smug triumph. They were dressed for victory, Julian in a sharp, expensive suit, Chloe in a dress that cost more than Alara's entire wardrobe for a year. Their lawyer, Richard Croft, met them with a wide, predatory smile. "Julian, Chloe, ready for the main event?" "More than ready," Julian said, clapping him on the back. "Let's get this over with so I can start my life." "She's already here," Croft said, gesturing toward a large conference room with a glass wall. "Been waiting for 10 minutes. Punctual, I'll give her that." Through the glass, they could see Alara. She was seated alone at one end of a massive, polished granite table. She was not looking at her phone or shuffling papers. She was sitting perfectly still, her hands resting on the leather folio placed on the table before her, her gaze fixed on the cityscape beyond the window. She looked small and isolated against the vastness of the room and the view. "Look at her," Chloe whispered with a sneer, trying to look all stoic. She must be terrified. "Let's not keep her in suspense," Croft said, his smile widening. He led them into the conference room. The air was cool and still. Ilara turned her head as they entered. Her eyes met Julian's, her expression unreadable. She gave a slight, formal nod of acknowledgement. "Julian, Chloe, Mr. Croft." They took their seats at the opposite end of the long table, creating a physical representation of the chasm between them. A junior associate placed glasses and a pitcher of water on the table, then scurried out, closing the heavy door behind him with a soft click. The room was soundproof, an isolated chamber for the dismantling of a marriage. Croft began, his voice smooth and condescending. "Well, Elara, we're glad you decided to be reasonable and meet with us directly. We think we have a proposal that is more than fair. Generous, in fact, given the circumstances." He slid a document across the polished table. "As you know, the primary marital asset is the house on Silverwood Lane. Its current market value is estimated at $3 million. After paying off the remaining mortgage, which stands at approximately $1.2 million, we're left with $1.8 million in equity." Ilara listened, her face impassive. She knew, of course, that there was no mortgage, but she let him continue. "Julian has graciously agreed to offer you a 40% share of that equity. That comes to $720,000, Croft announced, as if bestowing a great gift. In exchange, you will cede all claims to the property and any of Julian's other assets, including his pension and investment portfolio. It's a clean break. You walk away with a significant tax-free sum, free to start over. He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. The offer hung in the air, arrogant and final. Julian looked at Alara, a smirk playing on his lips. He expected her to gasp at the sum, to immediately agree, perhaps even to look grateful. Chloe was already mentally spending the money. Ilara did not look at the document. Her gaze remained fixed on her husband. A long, silent moment passed. "No," she said. The single word, spoken softly, landed with the force of a physical blow. Croft's smile tightened. "I'm sorry, I don't think you understand." "Oh, I understand perfectly, Mr. Croft," Ilara interrupted, her voice still quiet but now edged with steel. "I understand that you are operating under a series of profound and catastrophic misconceptions. And I understand that your client, my husband, is the source of them." She turned her full attention to Julian. $720,000, she repeated, the number sounding absurd on her lips. "Is that what you think my 10 years of partnership are worth? Is that the price of my silence, my dignity?" "It's more than you could earn in a decade with your little projects," Julian shot back, his anger flaring. "That," Ilara said, "is your first misconception." She slowly reached forward and opened the simple leather folio that had sat before her like a silent sentinel. Julian and Croft leaned in slightly, curious. They expected to see architectural drawings, perhaps a last-ditch attempt to prove her professional value. Instead, she pulled out a single, crisp sheet of paper and slid it across the table. It wasn't a legal document, it was a list. "Before we discuss finances," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, compelling them to listen closely, "I think it's important to establish the true nature of the debt between us, a debt that cannot be paid in dollars." She began to read. "June 12th, 2021, she started, her voice a calm, steady metronome of judgment. "At a dinner with the Hendersons, you referred to my designs as unrealistic fantasies. Chloe, you laughed." Chloe flinched as if struck. "August 29th, 2021, our 9th anniversary. You told me you had an urgent business trip. You took Chloe to a resort in Napa. I know because the credit card statement, which you apparently forgot I still had access to, listed the couple's massage package at the Auberge du Soleil." Julian's face went from red to white. "October 5th, 2021, your mother, in my home, called my life's work a cute little pastime and advised me to be a more supportive wife, while you stood there and nodded in agreement. January 18th, 2022, you forgot to invite me to your firm's award ceremony. You took Chloe instead. I saw the pictures on social media, Chloe wearing the necklace I bought you for your birthday." She continued, her voice never wavering. She listed a dozen more instances, each one a small, sharp blade twisting in their memories. The casual insults, the deliberate omissions, the public humiliations. It was not a plea for sympathy, it was a prosecutor's opening statement, a meticulous catalog of their crimes against respect. The air in the room grew thick and heavy. The smug confidence had evaporated from Julian and Chloe's faces, replaced by a dawning horror. They were being forced to look into a mirror, and they did not like the reflection. When she finished, she placed the list back in the folio. "That is the foundation of this discussion," she said softly. "Not equity, not assets, but a pattern of profound and sustained disrespect. You didn't just decide you wanted a different life, Julian. You actively tried to diminish mine. You tried to make me small so you could feel big." She looked at him, her eyes clear and piercing. "And that is your second and most critical misconception. You thought I was small." With that, she reached back into the folio. This time she pulled out a thick, bound document. She slid it across the table. On the cover were two words, Ethelred Industries. Croft picked it up, a confused look on his face. What is this? Some kind of business proposal? Turn to page 3, Elara instructed. Section 2, Founder and Sole Proprietor. Croft flipped the page. He read the entry. His eyes widened. He read it again, his mouth falling slightly open. He looked up at Elara, his face a mask of utter disbelief. "What is it?" Julian demanded, his voice tight with anxiety. Croft couldn't speak. He just stared at Elara. "Let me clarify for you, Julian," Elara said, her voice resonating with a power they had never heard before. "For the last 12 years, while I have been your quiet, unassuming wife, I have also been Helios." The name meant nothing to Julian or Chloe, but Croft, who prided himself on knowing the players in the world of high finance, felt a jolt of ice water shoot through his veins. Helios was a phantom, a myth, the mysterious, anonymous founder of Aethelred Industries, one of the largest and most profitable private technology and development corporations on the planet. A figure whose net worth was speculated to be in the tens of billions. That's impossible," Croft stammered, looking from the document to Elara. "Is it?" Elara asked. She pulled another document from the folio. "This is the deed to the house on Silverwood Lane. You'll note the mortgage was satisfied in full 6 years ago. You'll also note the owner is not Julian and Elara Vance. It is a holding company, which, as of 9 a.m. this morning, is wholly owned by me. You haven't been paying a mortgage, Julian. You've been paying rent into a trust I control." She pulled out another file. "This is a valuation of my personal assets, prepared by Goldman Sachs. I believe the number you'll be interested in is on the final page." Croft's trembling hands took the file. He flipped to the back. His face went completely gray. "What is the number?" Chloe asked, her voice a high-pitched, desperate squeak. Croft swallowed hard. 42.7 billion, he whispered. The sound of the number, so astronomical, so utterly incomprehensible, sucked all the air out of the room. Julian stared, his mind refusing to process the information. 42 billion? Elara? The quiet woman who clipped coupons and bought her books secondhand? The failed architect? It was impossible. It was a dream, a nightmare. "So, Mr. Croft," Elara said, her voice now cool and sharp as a diamond, "let's talk about a fair settlement. Your client has committed adultery, emotional abuse, and has been living in a home owned by me, using my assets to fund his affair. He has brought his mistress into my home, causing undue distress. He has conspired with his mother to devalue my contributions to this marriage. He has made my life a living hell for the last 2 months, under the mistaken belief that he held all the power." She leaned forward, her eyes locking onto Julian's. The quiet gray woman was gone forever. In her place sat Helios, a queen on her throne, and she was about to deliver her judgment. "Here is my offer," she said. "You will leave my house by 5 o'clock this evening. You will take with you only the personal effects you brought into our marriage. You will sign a full and unconditional release of all claims to any of my assets, personal or corporate. In return, I will not sue you for the emotional damages you have inflicted. I will not file a report with the board of your bank, the bank I am in the process of acquiring, detailing your moral and ethical lapses. And I will not release the full story of your spectacular stupidity to the press." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "You will leave my life, and you will walk away with nothing but the clothes on your back and the shame of what you have done. That is the only deal on the table. You have 10 minutes to accept." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a world completely and irrevocably shattered. Julian Vance sat frozen, a man who had walked into the room a king and was now being revealed as a court jester. His entire reality had been a fiction, a grand delusion of his own making. He had not been punching down at a weaker opponent. He had been standing on a beach, shaking his fist at a tsunami. Chloe was the first to break. Her face, which had been a canvas of smug confidence, had crumbled into a grotesque mask of horror and disbelief. The future she had so carefully curated, the life of luxury, the status, the envy of her friends, had vanished in an instant. She hadn't hitched her wagon to a rising star. She had chained herself to a sinking stone. Her head whipped toward Julian, her eyes blazing with a new emotion, pure, unadulterated fury. "You told me she was nothing!" she shrieked, her voice shrill and ugly. "You told me she was a failure, a hobbyist. You idiot, you absolute blind idiot." I... I didn't know," Julian stammered, his voice a pathetic whimper. He looked at Alara, his eyes pleading, searching for some sign of the quiet, gentle woman he thought he knew. But she was gone. The woman looking back at him was a stranger, her expression as cool and unyielding as the granite of the table. "You didn't know?" Chloe laughed, a high, hysterical sound. "Of course you didn't know. You never saw her. You were too busy looking at your own reflection to see the person standing right next to you." She stood up so abruptly her chair screeched back. $40 billion, and you threw it away for this?" She gestured wildly between herself and Julian. The irony was devastating. She had attached herself to him for his perceived status, and in doing so, had cost herself access to a level of wealth she couldn't even imagine. At that precise moment, there was a firm, polite knock on the conference room door. Before anyone could answer, the door opened, and Marcus Thorne stepped inside. He was impeccably dressed, radiating an aura of calm, absolute authority. He nodded respectfully to Alara. "Ilara," he said, his voice warm but formal. "I apologize for the interruption. I have the documents you requested." He walked to her end of the table, completely ignoring the stunned trio at the other end. He placed a slim briefcase on the table and opened it. The arrival of this powerful, confident man, who so clearly deferred to Alara, was the final, crushing confirmation of her new reality. This was her world. They had only been visiting. "Mr. Vance," Marcus said, turning his attention to Julian for the first time. His tone was not harsh, but it was utterly devoid of warmth. It was the voice of a man handling an unpleasant but necessary piece of business. He slid two official-looking documents across the table. "This is a formal notice of eviction from the property at 42 Silverwood Lane. As per the terms, you have until 5 p.m. today to vacate the premises with your personal belongings. A security detail is on site to oversee the process." He slid a second document over. "And this is for you, Miss Sterling. It is a restraining order prohibiting you from coming within 500 feet of Miss Vance or any of her properties, effective immediately." Chloe stared at the paper as if it were a venomous snake. Julian looked at Marcus, then back at Alara, his mind finally grasping the full, terrifying scope of his miscalculation. "Ilara, please," he begged, the word catching in his throat. "We can talk about this. We can fix this. I made a mistake, a terrible mistake." Ilara looked at him, and for the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed her face. It was not anger. It was not triumph. It was a profound and weary pity. "The mistake was not your affair, Julian. The mistake was that after 10 years you never knew your wife. There is nothing to fix. There is nothing left." She stood up, her movements graceful and final. "Marcus, please have Mr. Croft review the settlement agreement. I expect it to be signed within the hour." She picked up her simple leather folio, the humble vessel of her immense power, and tucked it under her arm. "Wait," Julian cried, scrambling to his feet. "Ilara, don't go. I love you. I've always loved you." The desperate, pathetic lie hung in the sterile air. Ilara paused at the door, her back to him. "No, Julian," she said without turning around. "You didn't love me. You loved the idea of me being small, and that is something I can no longer be for you." She walked out of the room, Marcus Thorne following a respectful step behind her, leaving Julian Vance to stand in the ruins of the life he had so arrogantly destroyed. He was no longer a king in his castle. He was just a man, standing in a borrowed suit, in a room that suddenly felt like a tomb. The silence he was left with was no longer a sign of his power, but the deafening sound of his own spectacular failure. The weeks that followed the confrontation were a brutal education in the physics of a fall from a great height. For Julian, the descent was swift and merciless. He left the lawyer's office in a daze, arriving back at the house on Silverwood Lane to find a discreet security team waiting. They were polite but firm, escorting him to the master bedroom as he packed a single suitcase with his clothes. Chloe was already gone, having fled the lawyer's office in a taxi, her parting shot a venomous glare that promised a lifetime of resentment. He watched as the life he thought was his was methodically erased. The security guard handed him a box containing the few personal items he had brought into the marriage a decade ago. Some old college textbooks, a tarnished silver photo frame, a set of golf clubs. Everything else, the art, the furniture, the very walls around him, belonged to her. He was an intruder. He had been an intruder all along. The true devastation began the next day. The news of Ethelred Industries' hostile takeover of Consolidated Mutual Bank was the top story on every financial news network. The predatory, unsolicited bid had been replaced by an all-cash offer so overwhelming that the board had capitulated within hours. The statement from Ethelred's CEO, Marcus Thorne, announced a complete corporate restructuring, starting with an executive leadership team that has failed to innovate and has lost the market's confidence. By noon, Julian had received a call from HR. His position was terminated, effective immediately. His golden parachute, which he had so often bragged about, was voided due to a morality clause he had never bothered to read. The story of his divorce, though not public, spread like wildfire through the corporate world in the form of whispers and rumors. He wasn't just fired, he was a laughingstock. The man who had a $40 billion wife and didn't know it. The ultimate fool. His attempts to contact Alara were met with a silent, impenetrable wall. His calls went to a disconnected number. His emails bounced back, blocked. He drove to the house once, in a desperate haze, but was politely turned away at the gate by a new security detail that informed him he was not welcome. He was forced to move into a small, bleak apartment in a rundown part of the city, the kind of place he would have sneered at just a month before. The silence in the cramped rooms was a constant torment, a stark contrast to the light-filled, airy spaces of the home he had lost. His mother, Eleanor, faced her own quiet ruin. The lowball offer from Argent Development for her real estate portfolio, which she had reluctantly accepted, turned out to be the only offer she would get. The day after the sale closed, Ethelred Industries announced that the Titan North development would be expanding, with Argent Development as its primary partner. The property values of the land she had just sold for a pittance quadrupled overnight. She had been outmaneuvered by the very woman she had dismissed as having no concept of priorities. The humiliations shattered her social standing. Her friends who worshipped at the altar of wealth and success now saw her as a failure, a victim of a colossal misjudgment. Her phone calls went unreturned. Her lunch invitations were politely declined. Meanwhile, Elara Vance, or rather, Helios, finally emerged from the shadows. She did it not with a splashy press conference, but with a quiet, powerful grace. A feature article appeared in a major international business magazine, penned by a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist to whom she had granted an exclusive interview. The article, titled "The Architect of Tomorrow, The Real Story of Helios," told the tale of a brilliant visionary who had built an empire while deliberately shunning the spotlight, preferring to let her work speak for itself. The article was accompanied by stunning photographs of Alara, not in a boardroom, but on site at her various projects. Walking through a newly completed sustainable housing project for the underprivileged, consulting with engineers at a cutting-edge desalination plant, sketching in a notebook while overlooking a city skyline she was actively reshaping. She was presented not as a ruthless corporate titan, but as a thoughtful, principled leader dedicated to using her immense power to solve real-world problems. The story of her divorce was mentioned only briefly, a single sentence about moving on from a partnership that no longer aligned with her values. She didn't need to sling mud. The world could infer the rest. She became an overnight global icon, a symbol of quiet strength, hidden genius, and female empowerment. She was everything Julian had ever wanted to be: powerful, respected, admired, and she had achieved it on her own terms, in secret, right under his nose. One afternoon, Julian sat in his grim apartment, watching a news report on his small television. The screen showed Alara, standing beside the Prime Minister of a small nation, announcing a multi-billion-dollar Aethelred investment to build clean energy infrastructure across the country. She was poised, articulate, and radiant. She looked happier and more alive than he had ever seen her. She was no longer a woman in shades of gray. She was a figure luminous with purpose. He looked around his own small gray room, at the peeling paint in the single window that looked out onto a brick wall. The contrast was a physical blow. He had aimed for a life of more and had ended up with infinitely less. He had discarded what he thought was a simple stone, only to watch it become the world's most coveted diamond in another's hands. The weight of his colossal, life-altering mistake pressed down on him, a burden he knew he would carry for the rest of his days. 3 months after the divorce was finalized, Julian received a message. It wasn't from Alara, but from her assistant, a polite, formal email requesting his presence at a meeting. The location was not an office, but the community center from the architectural model he and his friends had once mocked. The center had been built, funded entirely by the Helios Foundation, Alara's new philanthropic arm. It was a stunning piece of architecture, a harmonious blend of natural materials and futuristic technology, even more beautiful in reality than it had been in miniature. He arrived, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and dread. Was this it? A chance for reconciliation? A glimmer of forgiveness? He found Alara not in an office, but in the sun-drenched central atrium, talking with a group of children who were using the center's library. She looked up as he approached, her smile fading into a neutral, polite expression. She dismissed the children gently and turned to him. "Julian," she said. Her voice was calm, holding no trace of the anger or pain he had expected. It held nothing at all, and that was worse. "Alara," he began, his voice hoarse. "This place, it's incredible. You actually built it." "Yes," she said simply. "Some ideas are only unrealistic until someone has the will to make them real." The words were a quiet echo of the insults he had once hurled at her, but she delivered them without malice, as a simple statement of fact. I'm so sorry, Alara," he choked out, the words he had rehearsed 1,000 times feeling clumsy and inadequate. "I was a fool. I was blind. I was arrogant. I see that now. I see you now." She listened patiently, her hands clasped before her. When he was finished, a long silence stretched between them. "Do you know what I think, Julian?" she finally said, her voice soft. "I think you are sorry you lost. You are sorry for the consequences, for the public humiliation, for the loss of a life you now realize you could have had. But you are not sorry for the act itself. You are not sorry for the disrespect. Because if you were, you would have been sorry a year ago, or the year before that." This was the moral mirror, and its reflection was brutal. She was showing him the truth of his own character, a truth he could not refute. "You didn't come here today looking for forgiveness," she continued. "You came here looking for a second chance, a chance to get back what you threw away. But that is not possible. Not because I hate you, but because the person you were married to no longer exists. You and Chloe and your mother, you burned that woman to the ground. You should be careful what you burn. You never know what will rise from the ashes." She looked at him, her gaze clear and final. "I did not ask you here to punish you, Julian. I asked you here because I wanted to see if you had learned anything at all. I see now that you haven't. You are still thinking only of yourself." She paused and her expression softened for a moment with a touch of genuine sadness. "The opposite of love is not hate, Julian. It's indifference. And I feel nothing for you at all. You are simply a man I used to know." She held his gaze for a moment longer, then turned and walked away, back toward the sound of laughing children, toward the light-filled world she had built. Julian stood alone in the center of her triumph, a ghost in a place of vibrant life. He finally understood. This was not a negotiation. It was a conclusion. There was no path back. His apology was not a key, but a final, useless gesture at a door that had been permanently locked. He had not just lost a wife or a fortune. He had lost the chance to be a better man, a chance he never even knew he had until it was gone forever. He turned and walked out of the beautiful building, back into the grayness of his new life. The story was over. The lesson had been delivered. True worth is not in what the world sees, but in what you build when no one is watching. Respect is not a commodity to be demanded, but a foundation that, once cracked, can never truly be repaired. Ilara had built an empire. Julian had built a prison of his own regret, and he was its sole inhabitant for life. What a powerful journey from humiliation to ultimate vindication. Ilara's story is a profound reminder that our true value is never determined by the narrow vision of others. It's defined by our own integrity, our patience, and the strength we build in silence. She didn't seek revenge. She simply allowed the truth of her own worth to become a force of nature that rebalanced the scales of justice. I have a question for all of you watching. Have you ever been in a situation where someone completely underestimated you? How did it feel when you finally had the chance to show them who you really are? Share your stories in the comments below. Your experiences are a powerful part of this community. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey. If you found Ilara's story as satisfying and inspiring as I did, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel for more stories of justice and redemption. We'll see you in the next one.